My name is Rick, and I will be your instructor. Thank you for enrolling in this course. I've been a teacher for over 25 years, and I also teach teachers, those who might want to start their own freelance English language teaching business. I'm a Canadian, and my background is really in business and economics. I have a Master's of Arts degree in economics, and my first job was at the Bank of Canada in the nation's capital. From there, I moved to New York City on Wall Street to work at a derivatives exchange, investing in futures and options. From there, I opened up my first advanced educational institution. So this was a school of sorts that taught individuals how to invest in high yield assets, derivative products, specifically commodity futures and options. We quickly became the leader in the field in terms of teaching beginning traders, and I ran that business for about 14 years. In 2014, while I was down in Brazil, I established an English language school called the Online Canadian Academy. We specialize in teaching intermediate to advanced English, including conversation and professional business English. Now, I still teach from time to time now, mostly advanced English students who need professional business English for their work. And I also train teachers. Any teachers that want to work at my school in Brazil, I train them on the methodology that I use. Down in Brazil, there is a service called profis.com.br, which lists and ranks over 9,000 private sector English teachers in the country. In that list, I am ranked within the top 1% of 9,000 teachers. Based on an industry survey conducted in December of 2021, I am the highest paid private sector English language teacher in the country. I tell you this only so that you know that you are in good hands. In this course, our main objective is to learn a pattern to present financial values like you would in a meeting, for example. By financial values, I mean dollar figures, dollar numbers. Not only will we learn how to present the level of these financial values, but also compare that to the prior period. We will even move beyond that and learn how to analyze financial values to try to identify the pertinent or driving factors behind the data, and then describe what's going on in a few sentences. That is a difficult skill, and it requires practice. And before we can even start to do that, there are a lot of things that we need to learn along the way, such as working with numbers, especially large numbers. We need to increase our vocabulary, learn some new words and expressions that will come in handy when we are describing financial performance, and even some other tips and tricks to make us sound a little bit more professional. Now, the financial values that we will be studying and presenting are real. They come from a real financial statement from a real company. That company is Ford Motor Company, and I'm sure you know it. They produce cars and trucks. With that in mind, let's jump into it.
This is the income statement of Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries. Now, an income statement is also referred to as a profit and loss statement or a P&L statement. It's one of the financial statements that are most important for describing the financial performance of a company. It is looked at by investors and by top management. Investors want to know the health of the company, the profitability of a company before they decide to buy shares in that company or not. And the income statement provides the answers to those questions. The income statement is prepared over a period of time, usually monthly. So at the end of every month, it is prepared. If you have 1 month done, it is common to aggregate months into a period of 3 months or 6 months, and then the entire 12 months of the year. We are going to be focusing on the income statement in this course to present these values and then to describe in words what's going on here. This is relevant because practically all of my advanced business English students need English in order to present financial values, usually every month, to top management. The head office might be in Europe or the United States. The presentation must be in English, and these individuals have to present things like profit performance, how much money was made in the prior month, what were overall sales, what were expenses. They may have to present production, how many units were produced. That follows the same lines as what we will do here in this course. So presenting the important metrics such as total sales, costs, and profits is something which many people have to do in English. Let's take a look a little bit more closely at this income statement and make sure we understand it. First of all, the title, Ford Motor Company and Subsidiaries. Well, what is a subsidiary? Well, that is another company that Ford Motor Company owns 50% or more of the equity value in that company. So they are by far controlling shareholders in that company. So they own 50% or more of a company, and that company is called a subsidiary. Consolidated means everything together, meaning that these financial values include results from the main parent company, Ford Motor Company, and the subsidiaries, those companies which are controlled by Ford Motor Company. Now, the main objective of this course will be to present these financial values that you see in this income statement, and then be able to put in words, maybe 2 sentences or so, a description of the important or pertinent factors that have gone on. We need to answer the question, so what does this mean? What are the take-home messages? What is the most important thing in all of this data? So that will be our ultimate challenge. But before we can do that, we have to work in steps and start learning things along the way. One of the things that we will learn here is how, in fact, to read these numbers with confidence. So we need to make sure that we can read these numbers. I point out that these values here are in millions. So that complicates things a little bit for us. We need to be comfortable with understanding the value of these numbers, and we will look at that throughout this course. These values have been prepared as of the end of June for 2019. So the end of June 2019. Now the second quarter, what is that? Well, if I divide the year into quarters, then each quarter has 3 months. So January, February, March, that's the first quarter. April, May, June is the second quarter. July, August, September is the third quarter, and October, November, December is the fourth quarter. So this is the second quarter, which means that these values here are results aggregated or summed together for the second quarter, April, May, and June. So these are results in the second quarter of 2019, and for comparison, results are shown for the same period in the prior year. This column here is the second quarter of 2018. Over here, since we have June done, we can aggregate or sum together the first 6 months of the year from January to June, and that's called the first half of the year. So this column here shows us results in the first half of 2019. And for comparison reasons, values are shown for the first half of 2018, the prior year. Let's take a look at the items being reported in the income statement. These items over here can be referred to as line items or metrics, things that are being measured. So at the top, we have revenues. So revenues comes from three areas. Automotive revenues, so that is money that Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries receives from selling cars and trucks. Ford credit revenues, any idea what that is? Well, if you want to buy a car or truck and don't have enough money to pay for it all, you get a loan to pay for the balance. And you can go to your bank to get a car loan for that. Well, Ford Motor Company provides its own bank of sorts, and that's what Ford Credit does. So it's like a bank that provides loans to its customers so that they can buy vehicles from Ford Motor Company. And like any bank, the idea is to make profit. So these are revenues then from the Ford Credit operation of Ford Motor Company. And mobility, that's a new item. You see that the revenues are very small in this area. This is a line item recently created by Ford Motor Company. That will include autonomous vehicles, self-driving vehicles, and electric vehicles. It's very small right now, but obviously Ford Motor Company expects this to be a much larger share of revenue going forward. If I add these three together, I get total revenues. So this is the first thing that appears at the top of the income statement. And one of the things that people want to know, what were total revenues? Did they go up? Did they go down? Were they flat? The next item, cost and expenses. Cost of sales, that is the cost of producing the cars or trucks. You see that is the largest cost to Ford Motor Company. Then there are selling and administrative expenses. That would include salaries and other expenses. Interest and operating expenses, that might include utility bills, things of that nature. And then if I sum these three together, I get total costs and expenses. These are some more expenses. Interest. These two are interest payments. Ford Motor Company borrows money, like most companies. So some of the money they borrow to pay for their production of cars, we call that interest on automotive debt. So debt here are loans made by Ford Motor Company. This is what they paid in interest in this period. And this is what they paid on interest on other debt in this period. This metric is other income or loss. If it's positive like this, it's income. If it were in brackets, it would be a loss. So there's no loss here on this statement. So other income is income that arises in areas other than these three. An example of this might be, say, a Ford Motor Company sold some property and realized a gain on that property sale. That would show up in other income here. Equity in affiliated companies. An affiliated company is a company in which Ford Motor Company has also invested in. So Ford Motor Company bought shares in this company, but not half, not 50% of the value of the shares, less than that. Usually between 20% and 50%. That is referred to as an affiliated company. And when that affiliated company makes money, some of that revenue is passed through to Ford Motor Company, and those are the values that we see here. Now, if you take total revenues, subtract total expenses, subtract the interest payments, add the income here and the equity here in affiliated companies, then you get income before taxes. Provision for income taxes, well, that means money that is set aside to pay for income taxes. So you can think of that as being the income tax payment. And after that, we have net income. So this is net income. This is after having paid tax. Income to other interests, you see this is treated as an expense of sorts. It's taken out of net income, small payments made to other companies to which Ford Motor Company has a relationship. And then finally, we have the bottom line, net income of Ford Motor Company. You may have heard that expression, the bottom line. What's the bottom line? Well, it comes from this. It comes from the income statement because all of these values are used to construct this value, the bottom line. This tells you the net income, if the company has been making money or losing money and how much. Now that we understand this revenue statement, our task will be to present values for any metric over any period of time, then to analyze this to understand what really is going on in all of these numbers, what is the story to be told, and then finally to tell that story in words. This is a difficult exercise. We will work through it step by step, but it will be incredibly useful for you if you have to make presentations not only of values in English, but if you need to interpret or describe those values in a 1 or 2 sentence summary. Now, that is our main goal, but before we can do that, there are some things that we need to make sure we understand, need to make sure we can do. Let's take a look at those right now. One of the things that we are going to have to be able to do is count from 1 to 100 in cardinal numbers. That is a must. You probably already know how to do this. I hope you do, but let's just make sure that the pronunciation is correct because you will be presenting numbers. We need to make sure that our pronunciation is correct. We only need to study numbers from 1 to 100 because later on in this course, I will show you a methodology that if you know numbers from 1 to 100, you can read any large number in English. So let's start here, and I will say the number, and I would like you just to repeat, please, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 75, 76, 77, 78, 79, 80, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97, 98, 99, 100. Okay, let's do this. I will move my little hand underneath a number, and I want you to say the number. So this would be 25. I will say the number after you. So I'll leave a pause for you to say the number, and then I'll say it just to make sure that you were correct, okay? This number. 13. 34. 12. 21. 88. 18. 80. 15. 50. Okay, let's look at something else that you'll need to know as we go through this course. Alternative presentation. Some numbers by convention are spoken a little bit differently than what you might know. We'll look at two of them here. First is a 3-digit number. So we'll say the first digit alone, followed by the last 2 digits together. If the last 2 digits are less than the number 10, then use the word O for the 0 value. So let's take a look at the examples. This number right here. Now you may say this number as 225. That's not incorrect. You are right. But by convention, we say this a little bit differently just to economize, to make it a little quicker and easier. We'll say the first digit and the last 2 together. So that's 225. So I might refer to that number then as 225. This number here, you can say 575. That's not wrong. But by convention, we say 575. It's just a little faster. And finally, when we have a 0 here, so the last 2 digits are less than 10, this 0 here, I will refer to as O. So I will say 603. I can also say 603, but I'll say 603 as a way of saying this a little bit quicker. 4-digit numbers that end in 00. This, I think, is something unique to English. You may not have seen this in your own language, but what we'll do is this. We'll say the first 2 digits together, followed by the word 100. So let's look at this example. This number here is 1,200. That's not incorrect. However, that takes a lot to say. By convention, people say the first 2 numbers together and then 100. So this number here, 1,200. And that is the same whether you're talking about a year, like the year 1200, or say the number of pieces that were produced. 1,200 pieces were produced. This next number, 1,800. Yes, that's correct. But by convention, it's more common to say 1,800. 1,800. This number, 3,600. By convention, it's more common to refer to this as 3,600. It is useful to use this convention whenever you can, because people identify very quickly with this type of number. If you say 2,300 to someone in English or 4,800, they immediately know what that number is in their mind. So it makes it easy for them to comprehend that number. For that reason, we'll use this convention whenever possible. There's another convention that we'll use when expressing numbers, and that is with simple fractions. Let's take a look at that next. Here we've got some simple fractions. 1/2. If I say 1 million, okay, 500,000. Immediately you know what 500,000 is, right? 500,000. If I told you you won $500,000, you would be ecstatic. You know how much that is. So a simple fraction like 1/2 is an easy way to identify or comprehend the value of a number. So we'll use fractions whenever we can. Instead of saying 500,000, we might say 500,000. Or instead of saying 3,500,000, we might say 3.5 million. Take a look at the quarters. We have 1/4, which may also be called 1/4. 3/4, which may also be called 3/4. Notice that when we have 3, we have an S here. When there is 1, there is not. Here again, fractions are more readily identified and comprehended than numbers. So if I said 750,000, oh yeah, that's 750,000. So it's a little easier to say, but by using the fraction, people can comprehend better and faster the value. We'll just use one more simple fraction, in this case, thirds. This is 1/3, 2/3 with an S here, no S here. So these are the simple fractions that we'll use when we express numbers: 1/2, 1/4, 3/4, 1/3, and 2/3. All right, now that we are armed with these basics, let us continue.
Before we can start presenting financial values, we're going to have to be able to read large numbers with confidence. In this lecture, I will show you a simple methodology for doing exactly that. If you can read the numbers 1 to 100 in English, then you can read any large number. Let's take a look.
Reading large numbers. This number here may seem intimidating, but don't worry, it's actually quite rational how to read this number. Let's take it in steps. Well, groups of 3 numbers, like these 3 right here, or these 3 right here, or these 3 right here, are all treated in the same way. You say the first digit, followed by the word 100, and then say the other 2 digits that are underlined. Say this is one number. And then the only other thing you need to say is the value of the comma. So for example, this number here would be spoken as 623,796,414,583. Can you please repeat that for me? Okay, now things get a little bit more complicated when we have some zeros in there. So let's take a look. Now you see this number, we have some zeros. Well, this number is still just 7. This number is 20. When we have a 0 in the first place of our 3 numbers, then we do not say the 0 and we do not say the word 100. So this number would be spoken as 207,320,008,411. Can you repeat that for me, please? And finally, let's complicate things a little bit more by adding even more zeros. So in this number here, you can imagine that I have a 0 here. I do not have to write the 0, but because there's a 0 here, I will not say 0. I will not say this word 100. Same here. I will not say 0. I will not say 100. In this case now, we have 3 zeros together. And when this happens, we will not say 0, we will not say 100, and we will not say the value of the comma either. So we're going to skip over this and skip over this. So this number would be spoken as 66 billion, 13 million, 250. Can you repeat that, please? All right, and that is it. Reading numbers is as simple as that. Now let's put this into practice and read some numbers in the next exercise.
Now that we know how to read large numbers in English, let's put that into practice by reading some numbers. We'll start small and work our way up into the billions.
Reading large numbers. I will read the number and I would like you to repeat it. 3,073. 1,225. 6,360. 8,008. 23,125. 313,110. 610,025. 109,003. 7,313. 13,300. 22,127. 85,013. 215,502. 708,078. 119,816. 130,015. 170,107. 239,999. 601,003. 415,015. 1,239,783. 4,013,102. 15,001,011. 12,000,000. 26,026,026. 13,003,003. 95,020,405. 250,116,238. 635,006,035. 100,018,018. 737,700,037. 160,610,016. 213,213. 115,500,015. 106,060,006. 1,050,000,100,208. 7,700,000,70,070. 32,190,003,212. 49,800,016. 50,500,000,50,000. 14,014,014. Okay, now I will point to a number and I would like you to say it. I will say the number after you. So I'll leave a pause for you to say the number, and then I'll go ahead and say it, and you will know if you got it right or not. This number right here, can you read this number for me? So you should have said 23,125. Let's try another one. This number right here, can you read that, please? So that's 708,078. How about this number right here? 415,015. What about this number here? Go ahead and read that out loud. 15,001,011. Let's move on to some larger numbers. How about this number right here? Can you read that for me? Well, that's 100,018,018. How about this number right here? 160,610,016. What about this number right here? 1,050,100,208. What about this number right here? 49,800,016. And just read me this one right here. 50,500,000,050,000. Okay, I hope you did well on that, but let's move this to the next step in comprehension. I will speak some numbers to you. You won't see them. You'll have to write them down as I'm saying them. We'll do that in the next exercise.
Reading numbers is one thing. Listening to numbers that are being spoken to you and understanding that number, that's something else, and that's a more difficult exercise. That's what we're going to practice in this lecture. I will read some numbers to you and you will write them down, starting small, and we'll work our way to large numbers. This is an important skill to develop, as most people say numbers very quickly. In addition, some people have thick accents, and that makes it even more difficult to understand the numbers. Before you continue with this lecture, you might want to get a pen or pencil and a sheet of paper so that you can write down the numbers.
Before I test your comprehension of large numbers, I just want to review a few numbers that give people a lot of difficulty in English. The number, for example, 13, 30, and 30th. So these two are cardinal numbers. This is the ordinal number. But you can see these three numbers, they all start the same way when being spelled. It's just the ending that is different. So for that reason, when we pronounce these numbers, we have to make sure that we get the ending correct. 13, 30, 30th. So this is teen, TF. It is important that you enunciate that correctly while you are speaking these numbers, and you need to train your ears to listen for this as well when other people are saying these numbers. Teen and T, some people say teen very quickly, and it can sound a lot like T. So you have to listen very closely. Let's practice these numbers. I will say them first, and I want you to repeat after me, okay? 13, 30, 30th. 14, 40, 40th. 15, 50, 50th. 16, 60, 60th. 17, 70, 70th. 18, 80, 80th. 19, 90, 90th. Okay, now that we have practiced that a little bit, let's move on with our exercise. I will read you 5 numbers, one after the other, and I would like you to write them down on a piece of paper. To start, these numbers are not very large. They're small numbers, so I will say each number only once, and then move on to the next number. We'll do these 5 numbers, and then I will show you what the numbers are, and we'll see how you did. Okay, here are the numbers. I hope you are ready with your pen or pencil and paper. 616, 440, 1,239, 6,105, 9,019, 'And let me show you those numbers. There they are right now. You can go ahead and correct your answers. So how did you do? Did you get all 5 right? Well, let's move on and continue with this exercise. I have 5 more numbers. These numbers are just a little bit larger, but I'm going to read them only once as well. Let's see how you do. Okay, here we go. 12,440. 16,060. 32,312. 50,015. 66,307. And here are those numbers. Go ahead and correct your own. Okay, how did you do? I hope you did well. Let's move on. The numbers now will get a little bit larger, but each number I will say twice. So I will say the number and then repeat it. And then I'll move on to the next number and repeat it. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. 112,376. 112,376. 206,016. 206,016. 330,313. 330,313. 406,502. 406,502. 770,017. 770,017. And here are the numbers. Go ahead and correct your own. Okay, only you know how you did, but I hope you did well. Let's continue. Numbers will be a little larger still. Each one I will repeat. So just like the last time. All right, here we go. 15,050,500. 15,050,500. 36,600,630. 36,600,630. 770,007,700. 770,007,700. 808,880,080. 808,880,080. 990,019. 990,019. And here are the numbers. Okay, we have one last try at this. The numbers now will be even larger, but I will say each number 3 times. So I'll say it once and then repeat it twice. However, I will say the numbers a little bit faster than I have been before. Let's see how you do. Okay, here we go. 11,211,011,011. 11,211,011,011. 11,211,011,011. 13,013,013. 13,013,013. 13,013,013. 28,280,820. 28,280,820. 28,280,820. 39,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,039,0 39,000. 39 billion, 39 million, 39,000. 39 billion, 39 million, 39,000. $16 billion, 16,000, 16. 16 billion, 16,000, 16. 16 billion, 16,000, 16. And here are the numbers. Well, how did you do? If you got them all right, congratulations. Your comprehension of numbers is excellent. It's quite likely that you did not get all of the numbers. This is a difficult exercise, even for my advanced students. So what you might want to do is repeat this video again and test yourself again. Do that regularly until you can get all of the numbers correct.
Oftentimes, very large numbers are expressed in terms of thousands or millions. This is done to economize or save space on the page. This presents an additional challenge for us in understanding these numbers. For example, if I say 0.0037 million, what number is that? In this lecture, I will show you how to convert numbers that might be expressed in thousands or millions into the regular normal form in base units so that you can better understand that number.
Reading numbers in thousands and millions. Reading numbers in thousands. To read a number that is expressed in thousands, move the decimal place 3 spaces to the right. Let's take a look at some examples. The number 13. Well, there's a decimal after the 3, and I can imagine adding any number of zeros to the right of the decimal that I want to. So let's do that. Let's add some zeros to the right of the decimal, and that number would look like this. I just added 3 zeros to the right of the decimal. But here what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this decimal and I will move it 3 spaces to the right. So this number then becomes 13,000. Let's look at the next one. 148.95 thousand. Here again, to the right of the decimal, I can add any number of zeros that I want to. So let's add one more zero. That number will look like this. I just added 1 0. And now I'm going to take this decimal and move it 3 places to the right. So this number then becomes 148,950. Let's look at this number, 64,507.5 thousand. Remember, these numbers are all in thousands. This is my decimal. So I think to the right of this last digit, I will add some zeros. Let me add 2 zeros to that number. And that looks like this. So this is the same number. I just added some zeros to the end of it. But now this is my decimal. And I'm going to take that 3 places to the right. So that number becomes 64,507,500. And lastly, in our examples, 0.04 thousand. Well, here again, after the 4, I can add as many zeros as I want to. So let's just add 1 0. Now that I have my decimal, I will move it 3 places to the right. and that number becomes 40. Reading numbers in millions. To read a number that is expressed in millions, move the decimal place 6 spaces to the right. So let's take a look at some examples. This number 27, this number is in millions. Well, this is my decimal after the 7, so I can add as many zeros as I want to. Let's add 6 zeros after the decimal. And the reason I do that is because this decimal place, now I'm going to move 6 places to the right. And if I do that, the number becomes 27 million. This example, 329.16 million. Well, here's my decimal. I can add as many zeros as I want to the right. So let's go ahead and add some more zeros. Now I'm going to take my decimal, I'm going to move it 6 places to the right. And so this number becomes 329,160,000. Take a look at this number, 57,218.3 million. Remember, these numbers are all in millions. This is my decimal, so after the 3, I can add as many zeros as I want to. So let's go ahead and add some zeros. Now that I can see this, I'm going to take my decimal and I'm going to move it 6 places to the right. Once I do that, the number becomes 57,218,300,000. And finally, in our examples, 0.016 million. Well, after the 6, I can add as many zeros as I want to. So let's go ahead and add some more zeros. Now I'm going to take my decimal and I'm going to move that 6 places to the right. Once I do that, I have the number as 16,000. So that's how to read numbers in thousands or in millions.
When presenting financial values, or even writing them, we want to avoid saying numbers which are very long. For example, if the number is 13,254,196, I don't want to have to say that entire number in a presentation. It takes too long to do that. I interrupt the flow of the conversation, and people have little patience in waiting for you to recite this long number. We need a better way to refer to these large numbers. We need to abbreviate these numbers so that we can refer to them quickly without interrupting the flow of the presentation. How to do that, we'll be looking at in this lecture.
Abbreviating large numbers. When making verbal reference to a large number, say during a presentation or meeting, and especially when the participants can see the number written, it is helpful to abbreviate the number so that it can be referenced quickly without unduly interrupting the flow of the presentation. There are 3 basic strategies to abbreviate a large number. Strategy 1. If the number is close to but less than an even number that ends in zeros, then say that even number preceded with any of the following: just under, almost, approximately, roughly, about, or around. If the number is close to but more than an even number that ends in zeros, then say that even number preceded with any of the following: just above, just over, approximately, roughly, about, or around. Let's look at some examples. This number here, 119,739. If I'm in a presentation and I need to make reference to that number, that's a lot of things to say. I don't want to use up too much time saying all of that. So I will abbreviate this number. I notice that this number is very close to 120,000. 120,000 is a nice even number, has a lot of zeros in it. So it's close to that number, but not quite. So I can say just under 120,000. I could also say almost 120,000. And of course, I could say approximately 120,000 or roughly 120,000, about around 120,000. Look at the next example. 11,937,203. That's a lot to say. And I don't want to have to repeat that entire number during a presentation, say, because I might lose the momentum of the presentation. Looking at this number, I see that it's very close to 12 million. 12 million is a nice even number. It's not quite 12 million, so I can say roughly 12 million. I can also say just under 12 million or almost 12 million or any one of these other words preceding the 12 million. And then finally, this number, 1,297. I don't know if you are aware of this, but in English, when we have a 4-digit number that ends in 00, we call this number 1,300. So as another example, 2500, which is 2,500. It's more common to say 2,500. This number here is 1,300, and you can say 1,300. But in practice, it's more common to refer to this number as 1,300. People have an immediate identification with that number. So this is an even number in the sense that it ends in some zeros here. So if I look at this number here, 1,297, then I think, oh, that's almost 1,300, or just under 1,300, or about 1,300. So this is one strategy. If it's close to an even number, we'll reference that even number with something preceding it. Let's look at strategy 2. Change the units accordingly and round to the nearest 1 or 2 decimals. This is especially useful for very large numbers that are not close to an even number. Take a look at this first example. 35,893,449. Well, that's not close to 35 million. It's really not that close to 36 million either. So I cannot use strategy 1. So I think what I'll do is I will refer to this number in millions, and I'll just round it to 1 decimal. And if I do that, it's 35.9 million. So if I'm referring to this large number in a presentation, I don't want to say this whole number. I'll just say 35.9 million. This number, 1,350,126. Well, that's not close to an even number. So here again, I think I'll state this number in millions and round to a decimal. In this case, with the 5 here, I might want to keep 2 decimals to be a little bit more accurate. And I'll refer to this number as 1.35 million. This third example is when rounding and changing units becomes extremely helpful. Look at the size of this number, 36,294,471,765. Well, I don't want to say all of that in a presentation. I need a quick way to refer to this number. I think I'll put this number in units of billions, and I will round to 1 decimal place. And if I do that, it's 36.3 billion. All right, let's look at a third strategy here. If the number is close to being a fraction of a large even number, then express as that fraction, preceded with any of the following as is appropriate: just under, almost, just above, just over, approximately, roughly, about, or around. So if you remember strategy 1, if it's close to an even number, we'll reference that even number and say about, approximately. But if it's close to a fraction of an even number, then we'll use that fraction. And the kinds of fractions that we're talking about are 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, 1/3, and 2/3. That's about it. If you start referring to a number and saying, oh, that's 1/16 of a million, no one is going to understand that, right? Or 3/8 of a billion. Many people will have difficulty understanding what that number is. So we'll just stick to those simple fractions. Let's take a look at an example. This number, 251,338. Well, that's not close to an even number like 200,000 or 300,000. It's not close to that. But I notice that this is close to 250,000. And 250,000 is 1/4 of a million. And if I say to someone 1/4 of a million, they immediately know what that number is. So I'm going to use that as our reference. 1/4 of a million is 250,000. This is a little bit above that. So I'll just say that this number here is just over 1/4 of a million. I might also say approximately or about 1/4 of a million. Take a look at this next one. 1,498,759. Well, that's not close to 1 million. It's not close to 2 million. But I noticed that this 498,750, well, that's pretty close to 500,000, which is 500,000. So then I might refer to this number as being almost 1.5 million, or just under 1.5 million. Remember that 1.5 million is 1,500,000. So this is just underneath that. And finally, look at this one, 5,330,025. What can we do with that? Well, it's not that close to 5 million. It's certainly not close to 6 million. It's not even that close to 5.5 million. But this 330,025, that's pretty close to 1/3 of a million. Remember that 1/3 is 0.33333, all threes, right? So then I might refer to this number as 5.1/3 million. Now 1/3 would be 5,333,333. So this number is just under that. So I can say just under 5.1/3 million, or I can say roughly 5.1/3 million. So those are our 3 strategies for abbreviating large numbers, being able to refer to that number quickly in a verbal presentation. Let's put that in practice now by looking at an exercise.
Now that you know how to abbreviate large numbers, let's put that skill into practice. In this exercise, you'll be confronted with many large numbers, and you'll have to find a way to abbreviate those numbers so that you can refer to them quickly. You'll even have an opportunity to practice this skill on numbers that are expressed in thousands and millions. I recommend that before you continue with this video, you print out the exercise and try the material on your own. Once finished, continue watching the video for the answers with explanations.
Abbreviating large numbers. Exercise. How would you express the following numbers in an abbreviated form? In your responses, include group 1 or group 2 if appropriate. So group 1 includes these words. Group 2 includes these words. So instead of having to repeat, for example, saying just under this number, or almost this number, or approximately this number, or roughly this number, we will indicate the relevant group, meaning any of the words in that group will suffice, followed by the number. Let's take a look at an example that'll make it clear. Number 1, the number here is 6,249,854. How can I abbreviate that number? Well, it's not really close to 6 million. It's not close to 7 million. I could put that in millions and round to 1 decimal, but I have a better idea. This part here, 249,854, that's very close to 250,000, which is 1/4 of a million. So this number here is very close to 6.25 million. It's not quite. 6.25 million is 6,250,000. So this number is just under that, or almost that. So to abbreviate this, I can use any of these words from group 1, and I'll be referencing the number 6.25 million. Just like this. Any of the words in group 1, 6.25 million. So it could be almost 6.25 million, just under 6.25 million, roughly 6.25 million. Let's look at the next one. 13,802,553. Well, in this case, it's not really close to a large even number or a fraction of a number. So I think the best strategy here is to change the units to millions and round to one decimal place. And that number then becomes 13.8 million. When I want to refer to that number, that's what I'll say. Number 3, 7,795. Well, this is very close to 7,800, which we like to express in English as 7,800. If I say 7,800, people immediately know what that number is. Now, it's not quite that number, it's just under. So anything from group 1 and then 7,800 will work. Here again, 7,800 means 7,800, 7800. But we express that commonly as 7,800. Look at number 4, 69,859. Well, that is close to 70,000. It's not quite, so it's just under. So I think anything from group 1 and then 70,000 will work. Group 1, 70,000. So I might say almost 70,000, or just under 70,000, or about 70,000. Let's look at the next one. Number 5, 26,507,349. Well, it's not close to 26 million. It's not close to 27 million, those even numbers. But I see this part, 507,349. That's pretty close to 500,000, which is 500,000. So this number here is just over 26.5 million. Just over. So anything from group 2, any of these words will suffice. And the number will be 26.5 million. So just over 26.5 million, or just above 26.5 million, or roughly 26.5 million. Scroll down a little bit. This number here, 1,605. Well, I'm reminded of number 3. This is very close to 1,600, which in English we commonly say 1,600. And it's just above that. So I'll use anything from group 2 and 1,600. So I might say just over 1,600 or just above 1,600. Number 7, 332,687. Well, that's not close to 300,000, certainly not close to 400,000. It is close to a fraction. This number is very close to 333,333, which is 1/3 of a million. It's not quite that, it's a little bit underneath that. So I'll use anything from group 1, and then I'll refer that to as 1/3 of a million. So I might say just under 1/3 of a million, or almost 1/3 of a million. Number 8, 748,185. I look at this and I think that's close to a fraction. What fraction is it? Well, it's close to 750,000, which is 3/4 of a million. If I say 3/4 of a million, people immediately know what that number is. It's not quite there, it's just underneath. So anything from group 1 and then 3/4 of a million. So I might say almost 3/4 of a million, or just under 3/4 of a million, or approximately 3/4 of a million. This next one, 4,796,221. Well, that's not really close to 4 million or 5 million. It's not that close to a fraction. I think the best strategy is to change the units to millions and take it to one decimal. So that number then I would refer to as 4.8 million. Next number is quite large here, 498,972,471. Well, as I look at that number, I see it's quite close to 500 million, which is 500 million. It's not quite there, it's just under. So I think I can use anything from group 1 and then mention 500 million. just under half a billion, or almost half a billion. Let's take a look at number 11. 1,250,012. Well, I look at this part, 250,012. That's very close to 250,000, which I know is a quarter of a million. It's actually just over that. So I might use anything from group 2 and then reference 1.25 million. Just over 1.25 million, just above 1.25 million. Number 12, 899,484. Well, that number is quite close to 900,000, a nice even round number. It's just under that, so I might use anything from group 1 and then 900,000. Almost 900,000, or approximately 900,000. Number 13, 3,497,275. Well, this part, 497,275, that's quite close to 500,000, which is half a million. It's not quite that, it's just a bit under. So I might say anything from group 1 and then 3.5 million. So I might say almost 3.5 million, or just under 3.5 million. Let's look at the next one here, 215,701,366. Well, it's not close to 215 million or 216 million. It's not really that close to a fraction of a large even number. So I think the best strategy here might be to change the units to millions and round to 1 decimal. I'll refer to that number then as 215.7 million. Number 15, 4,398. Well, I'm reminded here, say, like of number 6. This is pretty close to 4,400, which in English we like to say is 4,400. And it's just under that number. So I might say anything from group 1 and then 4,400. Number 16, 5,334,714. What can we do with that? Well, this part here, 334,714, is very close to 333,333, which is 1/3 of a million. This number is actually a little bit above 1/3 of a million. So I might say anything from group 2 and then 5 1/3 million. So just above 5 1/3 million, or just over 5 1/3 million. Number 17, 84,995. Well, that is very close to 85,000. A nice round number. It's not quite 85,000, just under. So I'll say any word from group 1 and then 85,000. The next one, 2,749,077. Well, that's not really close to 2 million. It's not close to 3 million. I could change this to millions and round to 1 decimal place, but looking at this number, I think there's something even better. This part, 749,077, that's pretty close to 750,000, which is a fraction, 3/4 of a million. I find that people identify fractions easier than decimals. So whenever you have the opportunity to put something in fractions, like 1.5 or 1 3/4 million or 2.25 billion, it's better to use fractions. People can more readily identify that. So I will refer to this number as being almost, or just under, anything from group 1, 2 3/4 million. So almost 2 3/4 million, approximately 2 3/4 million. The next one, 9,189,724. That's not that close to 9 million. It's not really close to a fraction of a large number. I think our best strategy here is to change the units to millions and round to 1 decimal. So I'll refer to that number as 9.2 million. And then finally here, number 20, 250,014,000 932. That's a big number. It's pretty close to 250 million. And 250 million, I know, is a quarter of a billion. And this number, in fact, is just over that. So I'll use any number from group 2, and I'll say quarter of a billion. So just over quarter of a billion, or just above a quarter of a billion. All right, let's continue now. We looked at this before, numbers that are in thousands, values in thousands. So 75.3, remember we can just take the decimal over 3 places to the right. This number is actually 75,300. This number here, the decimal is here, take that to the right 3 places. So this number here is actually 4,935,000. So let's read this number first as it is. So this is 750.1 thousand is 750,100. How can I abbreviate that? Well, that number is just over 750,000, which I know is 3/4 of a million. So this number is just over 3/4 of a million. So I can use any number from group 2, and then I'll reference 3/4 of a million. So just over 3/4 of a million, just above 3/4 of a million, approximately 3/4 of a million. Let's look at the next one, 16,810,000. Once I expand that out, that's 16,810,000. How can I abbreviate that? Well, it's not close to an even number. It's not close to a fraction of an even number. I think the best strategy here is to put that in millions and round to 1 decimal. So I will refer to this as 16.8 million. Let's look at number 3. 26.8 thousand, which if I expand that out is 26,800. Okay, how can I simplify that? Well, that number then is very close to 27,000. It's actually just under. So I will use anything from group 1 referencing 27,000. So almost 27,000 or just under 27,000. Number 4, 1,498,000, which is 1,498,000. How can I abbreviate that number? Well, this part, 498,000, is very close to 500,000, which is 500,000. So this number here is almost 1.5 million, just under 1.5 million. So I'll use anything from group 1, 1.5 million, almost 1.5 million, just under 1.5 million. Number 5, 665.9 thousand, which is 665,900. Well, that number is very close to 2/3 of a million. 2/3 of a million is 666,666, all sixes. And this number is almost that, it's just underneath that. So I'll say anything from group 1, 2/3 of a million, almost 2/3 of a million, approximately 2/3 of a million. Number 6, 249.8 thousand, expanded 249,800. Well, that number now, I recognize that. That's almost 250,000, which is 1/4 of a million. It's actually just under 1/4 of a million. So I can use any of the words in group 1 and then 1/4 of a million. Almost 1/4 of a million, approximately 1/4 of a million. Number 7, 34,290,000, which expanded is 34,290,000. How can I abbreviate that? Well, it's not really close to 34 million or 35 million. It's not really close to a fraction of a large number. I think the best strategy is to put the units in millions and round to 1 decimal. So I will refer to this number as being 34.3 million. Number 8, 49.9 thousand. Well, expanded, that is 49,900. That's very close to 50,000. It's actually just under 50,000. So anything from group 1 and then 50,000. Almost 50,000 or just under or approximately 50,000. Number 9, 8,501,000. Expanded is 8,501,000. Well, this 501,000 is very close to 500,000, which I know is 500,000. So this number here is just over 8.5 million. So anything from group 2 and then 8.5 million will work. Just over 8.5 million, or just above 8.5 million. Finally, number 10 here, 35,958,000. Expanded is 35,958,000. That number is very close to 36 million. It's just under 36 million. So I can use anything from group 1 and then 36 million. Almost 36 million, just under 36 million. All right, that was value in thousands. Let's do the same thing now, but here we have values in millions. So this number here is 75.3 million. Take the decimal 6 places to the right, becomes 75,300,000. And this number, 4,935 million, take the decimal 6 places to the right, becomes 4,935,000,000 in expanded format. Let's take a look at number 1 here, 10.015 million. Well, if I take this decimal 6 places to the right, this number becomes 10,015,000. Well, 10,015,000 is just over 10 million. 10 million is a nice round number for us. So I'll say anything from group 2 and then 10 million. Just over 10 million, approximately 10 million. Number 2, 997.4 million. Expanded is 997,400,000. Well, that's pretty close to a billion. Actually, it's just under a billion. So I can refer to that number as any of the words from group 1 and then a billion. Just under 1 billion, almost 1 billion. Number 3, 250.8 million. Well, that's in expanded form, 250,800,000. So that number is just over 250 million, and I recognize that as being 1/4 of a billion. So this number is actually just over 1/4 of a billion. So I can use anything from group 2 and then reference 1/4 of a billion. So just over 1/4 of a billion, or approximately 1/4 of a billion. Number 4, 0.751 million. Well, in expanded form, if I move the decimal here 6 places to the right, that number is actually 751,000. Well, that is very close to 750,000, which I know is 3/4 of a million. Actually, this is just above that value. So I will refer to this number as being just over 3/4 of a million, anything from group 2, 3/4 of a million. The next one, 13,306 million. In expanded format, well, that's 13,306 million. Okay, what can we do with that? Well, it's not really close to 13 billion. It's not close to 14 billion. It's not really that close to any fraction. I think our best strategy here is to change the units to billions and round to 1 decimal. In which case, I will refer to that number as being 13.3 billion. Number 6, 501.2 million. In expanded format, that's 501,200,000. That's very close to 500 million, which I know is 500 million. So this number here is just over 500 million. So anything from group 2 and then 500 million. Number 7, 0.665 million. Well, if I move my decimal 6 places to the right, that number is actually 665,000. Looking at that, I realize that this is very close to a fraction. Fraction 2/3 of a million. 2/3 of a million would be 666,666. This number is just underneath that. So anything from group 1 and then 2/3 of a million. Number 8, 19,382 million. If I expand that out, it becomes 19,382 million. How can I abbreviate that? Well, it's not close to 19 billion or 20 billion. It's not close to a fraction. I think the best strategy is to put that in billions and round to one decimal. In which case, I would refer to that number as being 19.4 billion. The next one, number 9, 0.501 million. In expanded format, that's 501,000. Well, 501,000, that's just over 500,000, which we know is 500,000. So I will refer to this number as being just over 500,000. Anything from group 2 and then 500,000. Finally, number 10, 139,823 million. In expanded format, that's 139,823 million. Well, that's pretty close to 140 billion. It's actually just under that. So any of the words from group 1 and then 140 billion will work. All right, and that is how we abbreviate some large numbers. How did you do in this exercise? Some of those numbers were fairly difficult. You can always go through this exercise, do it again until you improve and are able to get all of these numbers correct.
Now that we are comfortable working with and understanding large numbers, it's time to start presenting financial values. We will do that in this lecture, presenting just the levels of financial values for Ford Motor Company from the income statement.
This is the income statement again of Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries. We already looked at this income statement in an earlier video. Let's take a look at it again in a little bit more detail. In particular, let's look at these values, these numbers, because this is what we will be presenting in this lecture. So take a look at this value right here. This value is 35,758, but these values are expressed in millions. So I can imagine adding 6 zeros to the end of this number. So when I present this value, it will be 35,758,000,000 US dollars. This number here, 6, well, that's 6 million US dollars. This number here, 230 million US dollars. This number here, 2,725,000,000 US dollars. Recall that this column here shows values in the second quarter of 2019. Second quarter are the months April, May, and June. So let's present these values here like we would say in a meeting. How do we do that? Well, presenting financial values over the second quarter can be done as follows. Insert the metric, and you recall that the metrics are these line items on the left-hand side of the income statement. So we'll insert the metric here and say at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries. Then we have to say was or were, depending upon if the metric is singular or plural. And we will look at that as we go along. Then we provide the dollar value of this metric. Remember, it's in millions. And we'll say US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. So we'll do 2019 first, and then we'll look at presenting values in the second quarter of 2018. So let's take a look at how this might work. Here's our income statement. If I'm going to present this first line item, well, let's look at two things. First of all, this is automotive revenues. That's plural, so I will be saying were. not was. And recall indeed that this is in millions, so that number is 35,758,000,000. So to present this value, I would say as follows. Automotive revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 35,758,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. And that's how we present that value. Let's take a look at total revenues. Total revenues is this line item right here. This is plural, so I will be using were again. Total revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 38,853,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. Let's take a look at a simple one here. Look at mobility revenues. Mobility revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 6 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. I'm going to ask you to try one. Can you try Ford credit revenues, please? Go ahead and try this out loud on your own. So you should have said Ford credit revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 3,089,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. Can you try cost of sales for me? Now, cost of sales is singular, so we'll be saying was, not were. So go ahead, try this out loud, please. By the way, and we do not need to repeat costs and expenses. So we can just say cost of sales at Ford Motor Company. Okay, go ahead and try that, please. So you should have said cost of sales at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 33,657,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. Okay, can you try selling and administrative expenses, please? So you should have said, first of all, selling and administrative expenses, that's plural. So we'll need to say were. So you should have said selling and administrative expenses at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 2,725,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. Can you try total costs and expenses, please? So this total costs and expenses is plural. So you should have said total costs and expenses at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 38,763,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. Can you do income before taxes, please? Try that yourself first, out loud. Income before taxes, is that singular or plural? Well, it's singular. So we'll need to say was. So you should have said income before taxes at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 205 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. And finally, can you present net income? Well, net income as well, that is singular. So you should have said net income at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 150 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. Presenting values in the second quarter of 2018, the same thing, except we'll say 2018 instead of 2019. So for example, Ford credit revenues, if I want to present that for 2018, it would be Ford credit revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 3,009 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2018. Can you present interest on automotive debt for me, please? Interest on automotive debt is singular, so you should have said interest on automotive debt at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 287 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2018. Can you present provision for income taxes? Provision for income taxes is singular, so we'll need to say was. So you should have said provision for income taxes at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 280 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2018. Presenting financial values in the first half of 2019, very similar again. We'll just change, instead of saying the second quarter, we'll be saying the first half. So to present automotive revenues, I would say as follows. Automotive revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 72,997 million US dollars in the first half of 2019. Can you present mobility revenues, please? Mobility revenues is plural, so you should have said mobility revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 12 million US dollars in the first half of 2019. Can you present cost of sales, please? Cost of sales is singular, so you should have said cost of sales at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 67,599 million US dollars in the first half of 2019. How about other income? Can you present that, please? Other income is singular, and since this is positive, it is income. If it were a loss, it would be in brackets. So I do not need to mention loss here. This, in fact, is income. So this would be presented as other income at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 900 million US dollars in the first half of 2019. And can you present net income? Net income is singular, so you should have said net income at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 1,333 million US dollars in the first half of 2019. By the way, if I wanted to express this as a fraction, what would I say? Well, this 333 million, that is exactly a third of a billion. So this number I could have stated as being 1 1/3 billion. So I could have said net income at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 1 1/3 billion US dollars in the first half of 2019. If we want to present the first half of 2018, almost identical, just changed the year. Can you present total revenues for me, please? Total revenues is plural, so you should have said total revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 80,879,000,000 US dollars in the first half of 2018. Do one last one. Can you present interest on other debt for me, please? Interest on other debt is singular, so you should have said interest on other debt at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 28 million US dollars in the first half of 2018. And that is how we present the levels. When I say the levels, I just mean the total aggregate value. Something a little bit more challenging now is to present the level and then compare that to the level in the prior period. This is our task in the next lecture.
In this lecture, we will continue to present financial values of Ford Motor Company, but we'll take it one step further and we will compare the value to the value of a prior period. This is a more challenging exercise, but also more relevant. In most cases, individuals want to hear the current value relative to the prior period, as this gives them a better indication of financial performance.
We are back at the income statement. Our challenge now is to present these financial values in the second quarter of 2019, which is the most recent data in this statement, and compare that to the prior period. So before we actually go ahead and do that, let's give a quick look at the change in these values. Let's see if it's up or down, and if it looks like it's a slight change or substantial change, or neither slight nor substantial. So I see that in the prior period here, 35,905,000,000, that was a little bit higher than the more recent period. So the level has fallen or decreased. So let's remember that, and let's take a look at how we can present this. Well, the first part, insert the metric at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was or were, and then we insert the value in the second quarter of 2019. That's exactly what we did in the prior lecture. That's just presenting the level. So we know how to do that pretty comfortably. But now we have to talk about the change. We have to select the most appropriate. The top three is if the amount increased or went up. The bottom three is if the amount went down. So when we looked at automotive revenues, it was a decrease, correct? Let's jump back. It went from this value to this value. So that's a decrease. So we can say a decrease from, so after we say this, the value, we can then say a decrease from, or we could say down from. Both of those say the same thing. You can select which one you want to say. And then we will say the value US dollars in the same period of 2018. So we'll be selecting among these three, a decrease from or down from. The question now, is this change, is this substantial? Is it slight? Or is it neither of those two? How do you make that determination? Well, the most appropriate way to make that determination is to look at a time series of this. Look at these values over large periods of time. Last quarter, the prior, over many, many years, and just see how this value bounces around normally by itself. So let's say that the range over, say, the last 5 years has been between these levels, for example. So if we are just a little bit in that range, then you might say it's a slight movement. If it's to this end or even outside of the range, then you might say it's a substantial movement. That's one way to do it. Probably, though, the best way is to ask your boss and say, should I characterize that change as being slight or substantial or none of the above? Just mention it as being a change. The reason I say that is because it may be that to you, it might look like a slight change, but if your boss has been, say, really working on this value and putting a lot of time and effort into getting this value either higher or lower, then your boss might consider that change to be substantial, in which case you should represent that as being substantial. So these qualifiers, such as slight or substantial, before you use them in a presentation, you might want to just get the okay from your boss. For our sake, though, I am going to tell you what can be represented as substantial or slight. So the change in value of these metrics here can be regarded as substantial. The change in value of these metrics can be regarded as slight. So let's use that just for this presentation. And you'll see automotive revenues is listed under those metrics, which can be regarded as being a slight change, which means that when we present automotive revenues, I'm going to say this line, a slight decrease from, and then I'll give this value. Or I might say down slightly from, and then I'll give the value in the prior period. All right, so now that I know how I will characterize this change, let's go ahead and present it. So if I'm going to present automotive revenues here from the second quarter of 2019 versus the prior period, and here again, instead of the prior period, I'll say in the same period of 2018, okay? I will end this by saying in the same period of 2018. I will say this as follows. Automotive revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were $35,758,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019. Now, up to this point, I've just presented the level, and we've done this before, so we're comfortable doing that. And then I will say down slightly from, or I could say a slight decrease from, $35,905,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Let's take a look at Ford credit revenues. Well, it was this value, the more recent is this, so this has increased. All right, is that a substantial increase, a slight increase, or none of the above? Let's take a look at our list here. You see Ford credit revenues, well, I call that a slight. The change is slight. So we're going to say a slight increase. So we can say a slight increase from, or we can say up slightly from, whichever you wish. So let's present this one. Ford credit revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were $3,089,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, up slightly from, or a slight increase from, $3,009,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Can you try total revenues? Now let's look for a minute at the change. Well, it went from here to here, so that's a decrease. Is this slight, substantial, or none of the above? Well, let's take a look. I see total revenues here, so it is a slight. The change is slight, and it's down, so you'll be saying a slight decrease from or down slightly from. Okay, do you want to go ahead and present Total revenues, that change? Okay, you should have said total revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 38,853,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, down slightly from, or a slight decrease from, 38,920,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. All right, let's take a look at cost of sales. Cost of sales went from this value to this value. So that is an increase. Is that slight or substantial or none of the above? Let's take a look. Cost of sales is not here or here. So then we will not mention slight or substantial. We will just mention an increase from or up from. So cost of sales, if I present that, it would be as follows. Cost of sales at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 33,657,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, up from or an increase from 33,194,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Can you do interest and operating expenses, please? So if we take a look at this, it went from this value to this value. So it increased over the period. Is that a slight increase? Well, let's take a look. Yeah, I see interest and operating expenses. We'll call that slight. So you'll be saying a slight increase from or up slightly from. So can you go ahead and present that now, please? So you should have said interest and operating expenses at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 2,381,000,000 US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, up slightly from or a slight increase from 2,362,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Let's look at this one. Other income. Other income went from this level to this level. So it declined. Is that substantial? It looks substantial to me. Let's see if it's in our list. You see other income right here. We'll call that substantial. So we're going to say then a substantial decrease from or down substantially from. So I wonder if you want to try to present that one for me right now. Remember, other income is singular. So you should have said other income at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 272 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, down substantially from, or a substantial decrease from, 1,000,000,004,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Let's take a look at net income of Ford Motor Company. This is the bottom line now. So when I say net income of Ford Motor Company, I do not need to say at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries. It's already included here. So I'll just say net income of Ford Motor Company. This is singular. So I'll say was, and then I'll give the value and then the change. So if I look at this value, it went from this to this. So that's definitely a decrease. Is that substantial? Looks substantial to me. Let's see if it's in our list. Net income. Here's net income of Ford Motor Company, and that move, in fact, is substantial. So we'll be saying that the same thing, a substantial decrease from or down substantially from. Do you want to try to present that, please? Net income is singular. So you should have said net income of Ford Motor Company was 148 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, down substantially from, or a substantial decrease from, 1,066 million US dollars in the same period of 2018. There's one last thing I want to look at. Take a look at mobility revenues. It went from here to here. Well, that's no change. So how do we present that? Well, let's take a look. If there's no change in the value of a metric, then it can be presented as follows. So we'll say the metric at Ford Motor Company was, we'll give the value in the second quarter, and we'll just say unchanged from the same period of 2018. Unchanged from the same period of 2018. So if I want to present mobility revenues, I would say mobility revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 6 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, unchanged from the same period of 2018. Can you present interest on other debt for me, please? Interest on other debt is singular, so you should have said interest on other debt at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 14 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, unchanged from the same period of 2018. Let's take a look at doing the same thing, but now values over the first half. So this is the first half or the first 6 months of 2019, and compare that to the prior period, the first 6 months of 2018. Let's take a look at automotive revenues. They went from this value to this value, so that's a decline. Is that substantial or not? Well, let's take a look at our list here. This is comparing to the first half of the year. All of this follows the same pattern as last time, but now we'll be saying in the first half of 2019, these are the values that can be considered to be substantial and no. And these are the values that are slight. So our metric, automotive revenues, is not in any of them. So in this case, then it was a decrease. So we'll just be saying a decrease from or down from. So if I want to present this metric, I would say as follows. Automotive revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 72,997 million US dollars in the first half of 2019, down from or a decrease from 74,917,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Okay, I wonder if you can do forward credit revenues. Now let's take a quick look. You see that this is up, so it's an increase. Is that substantial or slight? Well, let's take a look at our list. Forward credit revenues is here, so we will characterize that change as being slight. So it'll be a slight increase from, or up slightly from. All right, can you go ahead and present that forward credit revenues, please? So you should have said forward credit revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 6,186,000,000 US dollars in the first half of 2019, up slightly from, or a slight increase from, 5,952,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Let's take a look at mobility revenues. Well, it went from 10 million to 12 million. So it went up, that's an increase. The question is that slight or substantial or none of the above? Well, it's up 20%. And normally any change 20% is fairly substantial. So you might be inclined to think that's a substantial increase. However, if we look at the levels from 10 million to 12 million, this is an increase of $2 million. Well, what is $2 million when you're talking about 73 billion? So we need to look at the level in addition to the percentage change to get an idea of what we consider to be slight or substantial. Here again, that's a good reason why you should run this past your boss or supervisor before you characterize a change as being slight or substantial. Let's just see if mobility revenues is in our list anywhere. Well, these are the substantial changes. These are the slight changes. Mobility revenues is not anywhere. So then we will just characterize this as an increase from or up from. So can you present mobility revenues, please? So you should have said mobility revenues at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 12 million US dollars in the first half of 2019, up from or an increase from 10 million US dollars in the same period of 2018. Let's take a look at total costs and expenses. Well, they went from this value to this value, so that's a decrease. Is that substantial or not? Let's take a look at our list. And under substantials, no, I don't see that in here or even in here. So we will just mention this as a decrease from or down from. So can you present total costs and expenses, please? Well, you should have said total costs and expenses at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries were 77,903,000,000 US dollars in the first half of 2019, down from or a decrease from $79,172,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Let's take a look at other income. Other income went from this level to this level, so it's definitely down. Is that substantial, slight, or none of the above? Let's look at our list. Other income is right here, and we will characterize that change as being substantial. So we'll be saying a substantial decrease from, or down substantially from. Other income. Okay, can you present that for me, please? You should have said other income at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 900 million US dollars in the first half of 2019, down substantially from, or a substantial decrease from, 1,867,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. Take a look at income before taxes. Well, it's down. It looks substantial to me. Let's take a look at our list. Yeah, income before taxes is right there, and we'll consider that change to be substantial. So we're looking at the same thing, a substantial decrease from or down substantially from. Can you present income before taxes for me, please? So you should have said income before taxes at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 1,815,000,000 US dollars in the first half of 2019, down substantially from, or a substantial decrease from, 3,268,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. And let's do one last one. Net income of Ford Motor Company, the bottom line. It went from this value to this value. Let's see if that is substantial. Well, net income of Ford Motor Company, yeah, we're going to consider that to be substantial. So it's a substantial decrease from or down substantially from. Can you present that bottom line for me, please? And you should have said net income of Ford Motor Company was 1,294,000,000 US dollars in the first half of 2019, down substantially from, or a substantial decrease from, 2,802,000,000 US dollars in the same period of 2018. All right, let's just look at one last thing. Take a look at interest on other debt. You see that it's the same value. Do you want to try to present that for me right now? Well, it would be interest on other debt at Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries was 28 million US dollars in the first half of 2019, unchanged from the same period of 2018. All right, and that is how we present financial levels and changes relative to a prior period.
Now that we have become proficient in presenting financial values, it's time to move on to the next challenging step of writing a financial analysis of performance. Before we can do that, we're going to have to increase our vocabulary and learn a few words, expressions, and even terminology that is typically used when describing financial performance.
Let's look at words or phrases or adjectives that we can use to describe sales. And when I say sales, I mean the dollar value of sales. So in this case, we can say an increase in sales, for example. This would be a decrease in sales. We can say sales were up or sales were down. We can say higher sales, like due to higher sales or due to lower sales. We can say a rise in sales or rising sales, a fall in sales or falling sales. We can use this adjective, stronger. We can say sales were stronger in the third quarter, or income rose due to stronger sales. The opposite, weaker sales. We can say a strengthening in sales. Profits were up due to a strengthening in sales, or a weakening in sales. We can say a pickup in sales. In the third quarter, we saw a pickup in sales. The opposite, in the third quarter, we saw a decline in sales or a reduction in sales. And finally, this characterization is very nice, affirming in sales. So I might say that there was a firming in sales toward the end of the year, or the opposite, a softening in sales. Profits were down due to a softening in sales. So there is a wide variety of words, expressions, adjectives that we can use to describe the behavior of sales, whether up or down. Let's look at the category of costs or expenses or income. Well, we can say an increase in costs or an increase in expenses or an increase in income or a decrease in all of those things. We can say costs were up or expenses were up, or we can say costs were down, expenses were down, or income was down. We can say higher costs or higher expenses, lower costs, lower expenses. We can say a rise in costs or rising costs, a fall in expenses or falling expenses, and then a pickup in costs or a decline or reduction in costs. So for costs, expenses, and income, we can confine ourselves only to these characterizations. We saw those already here in sales, but things like affirming in sales, no one says affirming in costs. We don't say a strengthening in costs or a strengthening in expenses. We don't say a softening in expenses or weakening expenses. So there are some characterizations that we use for sales that we do not use typically when describing costs, expenses, or income. Let's look at market share. If we're talking about market share, well, we can say an increase in market share or a decrease in market share. We can say a rise in market share or rising market share, a fall in market share or falling market share. This is useful for characterization of market share, an expansion in market share. The opposite, a contraction in market share. And of course, we can say greater market share or less market share. And we can say a gain in market share, a loss of market share. If we're talking about efficiency or cost efficiency, efficiency here means that to produce the same thing, you are using less resources. So if efficiency has gone up, improved, we can say an increase in efficiency. I can say an increase in cost efficiency, or I can say a decrease in efficiency. I can say an improvement in efficiency or a deterioration in efficiency. That's a nice characterization for efficiency. And then I can say greater efficiency or less efficiency. And now let's talk about profit margin. I'll explain what this is in a few minutes, but for now, to characterize the behavior of profit margin, I can say an increase in profit margin or a decrease in profit margin. This is a nice characterization. An improvement in profit margin or a deterioration in profit margin. And this one is very nice too. More favorable profit margin. So we might say that profits were higher due to a more favorable profit margin or less favorable profit margin. So these then are the typical characterizations that we use for discussing these key elements. And these key elements will be part of the financial analysis that we perform. I want to look at one word here, offset. This is very useful in describing financial performance. So let's make sure we understand what we mean by this. Well, let's say that we have two variables. One goes in one direction and the other goes in the opposite direction. So this might be, for example, revenues that go up and then costs that take profit down. But this might be within costs, for example, something drives costs up, like say overtime, but then something else takes costs down, like for example, better efficiency of inventory. So whatever the two variables are, doesn't really matter as long as it's clear that one moves in the opposite direction as the other. So in this first case with A moving one direction, B takes us right back to the starting point. So we can say that B offsets A. If you want, you can use these adverbs as well. I can say B completely offsets A, or B exactly offsets A, or B fully offsets A. I can also use passive voice and say that A was fully offset by B, or was exactly offset by B. In the second situation, we have the same movement in A in one direction. B takes us back, but not all of the way. So in this case, I would say B partially offsets A. In passive voice, I can say A was partially offset by B. So the net result from this is you see still a movement in the direction of A, but not as much. The net movement is still in the direction of A. And finally, this characterization, we have the same movement in A, but B now takes us back and then beyond, even farther. So we say B more than offsets A. I can also say A was more than offset by B. So the net movement now you see is in the direction of B. B dominates the two movements. And finally, let's look at profit margin. What do we mean by profit margin? Well, let's just say that this here is 1 unit of production. Whatever it is we produce, it might be a car, it might be a piece of machinery, it could be a hammer, a tool, whatever. The green amount here is the selling price that we get for this unit that we produce. And the red amount is the total cost attributed to producing that 1 unit, the cost of production, including all things. The difference between the top selling price and then the value of the production here. So this little bit here, in excess of the production cost, is referred to as the profit margin, or sometimes just the margin. Obviously, this must be positive. If this is negative, so if the cost exceeds the selling price, then you're losing money, and no one will do that. You won't stay in business for very long. So when I'm referring to the profit margin here, there are two ways that the profit margin can improve. Number one is we can increase the selling price, which means the green level here goes up, the red level stays the same, green level goes up. So that means we just put a higher price on the unit, sell it for a higher price. Or the other way that the profit margin can increase is by reducing costs. We can keep the price the same and reduce the cost. In this regard, we have improved the efficiency or cost efficiency. We have been able to produce the same unit, but using less resources, less cost. Making reference to the profit margin is a nice way then to relate both sales value and the cost value. And we will see how that can be done in the following lectures.
In this lecture, we are still preparing ourselves for the task of being able to describe financial performance in words. In this lecture, we're going to be working on speaking a little bit more professionally by avoiding the excessive use of the conjunctions because and. We're going to use other phrases instead of those words. This lecture has an exercise with it, so I recommend that you attempt the exercise before watching the rest of this video. This exercise is unique in that it is a writing exercise, so there is no one right answer. Go ahead and try to answer the questions, and then take a look at this video, and I will give you some of my answers for the questions.
Doing better than because and. When describing financial performance, the business professional should avoid the excessive use of the conjunctions because and. Instead of using because, it is preferable to use a conjunctive phrase such as a result of, caused by, in response to, due to, owing to, driven by. Example, net income declined due to the expense of a product recall. I could also say net income declined in response to the expense of a product recall. Or net income declined caused by the expense of a product recall. Or net income declined as a result of the expense of a product recall. All of that is better than saying net income declined because of the expense of a product recall. So we will avoid using the word because. It is not very professional. Instead of using and, it is preferable to use a conjunctive phrase such as along with, coupled with, accompanied by, together with. Example, heavy rain accompanied by hail lasted for 30 minutes. I could also say heavy rain along with hail lasted for 30 minutes. Or heavy rain together with hail lasted for 30 minutes. All of that is better than saying and, better than saying heavy rain and hail lasted for 30 minutes. There's nothing really wrong with the word and, but we don't want to use it too often in a sentence. If we find that we are repeating the word and a few times in the sentence, then we should replace one or several of those with one of these conjunctive phrases. Let's take a look at our exercise. This is a little writing exercise here. Create a sentence using the words shown and the conjunctive phrase in brackets. So we need to create a sentence that has the word production in it and the word customer demand in it. And we need to have this phrase as a result of in the sentence. These two words can appear in any order. So this word might appear first in the sentence, or this might appear first in the sentence. It doesn't matter as long as it is a complete sentence and it makes sense and we have met the criteria. Now, there is no single answer to this exercise, but let me show you some of my sentences. Okay, the first one, production, customer demand as a result of. Well, as an example, we could say production is being increased as a result of stronger customer demand. So we have our conjunctive phrase as a result of, and that sentence works fine. How about the next one? Employee fatigue, accidents caused by. Well, let's take a look at a sentence that I put together. In the workplace, most accidents are caused by employee fatigue. So in this case, I have reversed the order of the words here, which is fine. That's acceptable. Your sentence might be correct also. I'm just giving you these other sentences as an example. Number 3, customer complaints, quality standards in response to. Quality standards were raised in response to an increase in customer complaints. Let's take a look at number 4. Overtime payments, total costs due to. A sentence using all of those words and phrases could be total costs fell due to a reduction in overtime payments. Number 5, downtime, imported parts owing to. As an example, unscheduled downtime reached a new low owing to better inventory management of imported parts. In case you don't know what downtime means, that refers to time on a production line when nothing is being produced because one or several machines are not running. Downtime can be scheduled. This is often done for maintenance, for example, routine maintenance, or can be unscheduled. Unscheduled downtime means that production has stopped because of something unscheduled, unforeseen, like a machine broke down, or maybe the power was out to the building, or maybe you ran out of parts in inventory that you need for production. So unscheduled downtime is a bad thing. Unscheduled downtime, we like to bring that to as close to zero as possible. So in this example, unscheduled downtime reached a new low. That's good news. That's very good. Owing to better inventory management of imported parts. So what that means then is that the imported parts, these are used in production, and the inventory is better managed, meaning that the company does not run out of imported parts during the production process. So production does not need to be stopped because there are no more imported parts. Number 6, import costs, foreign exchange rate movements driven by. Import costs, in this case, I mean the cost of importing goods. An example using these words and expressions would be imported costs rose substantially in the last quarter, driven by unfavorable foreign exchange rate movements. Okay, that means basically that the cost of importing material that you need increased because the exchange rate moved against you, or because of the exchange rate, it became more expensive to buy those imported parts. Number 7, salary, opportunity for promotion, along with. All right, what do we got for this one? A fair salary along with opportunity for promotion are the most important factors determining job satisfaction. Let's continue. Number 8, stress, fatigue, coupled with. How can we make a sentence with that? Well, how about this? Most human errors are caused by stress coupled with fatigue. That's also a very true statement. Number 9, production profit margin accompanied by, and we know this term profit margin that was described in the prior lecture. Let's take a look at a sentence using all of these terms and expressions. Higher production accompanied by an improved profit margin drove profits to a new high. An improved profit margin, we have seen that in the prior lecture too. It means the profit margin increased, which means either the selling price was higher or the cost to produce was lower, or both. Those are both good things. Higher profit margin means higher profit overall. And finally, number 10, coffee break, vacation time, together with. Let's take a look at this sentence. 2 short coffee breaks during the workday, together with 3 weeks of vacation time over the year, are recommended for avoiding employee stress and burnout. That's a long sentence, but it certainly satisfies the criteria. So now that you have seen these examples here, take a look at yours. Again, make sure that the sentences are complete and grammatically correct. And if you want, try to write a second sentence for each one. That'll be good practice in using these conjunctive phrases.
We are getting closer to our ultimate goal of describing in words the financial performance of the income statement of Ford Motor Company. The strategy for this will be to look at net income after taxes, and then look at total sales and total costs, which are the primary determinants of net income. In this lecture, we're going to look at 4 scenarios, each one having different behavior of sales, costs, and net income. And for each scenario, we will describe in words what is going on. This will provide a useful reference to us in the future. If we are ever confronted with a particular profile of sales, expenses, and net profit, we only need to compare that with one of the 4 scenarios in this lecture, and we will already have a good idea of how to start the financial analysis.
Financial performance summaries. Describing financial performance means summarizing in one sentence or two the main trends or factors that appear in the financial data. The description should answer questions such as, how is the performance overall, and what's driving that performance? With regard to the income statement, the description starts with the performance of net income after tax, its value, and how that changed relative to the prior period. This is the bottom line, or most important number on the income statement. To explain this performance, description focuses on the main determinants of net income, total revenues and total expenses. Finally, any specific items that significantly contributed to the performance of net income are mentioned. This is our model, our plan of attack when we look to the income statement of Ford Motor Company and attempt to describe in words what is going on. We will start by describing net income after tax, the bottom line, its value and how that changed relative to the prior period. And then we'll look to find those factors that influence net income. And for sure, we will look at total sales and total expenses, since those are the two main determinants of net income. Once we've done that, we'll take a look in the income statement and see if there are any other factors that significantly contributed to the result that we need to mention. That is the main goal, and that will be the topic of the next lecture. In this one, we are going to take a step in that direction by looking at simplified scenarios and learning how best to describe each one. Examples of how to describe in just a few words the relationship between net income and revenue and expenses are provided in the 4 scenarios below. The financial values are fictitious. Let's take a look at scenario number 1 here. We only have 3 line items or metrics: total sales, total costs, and net income. We have these values in 2 periods, 2 years, 2019 and 2020, and this is the percentage change from 2019 to 2020. So $13.1 billion is 10.1% higher than $11.9 billion in the prior year. So as I look at these values, I see that total sales was up, total costs were also up, and net income was up. On a percentage basis, I see that total sales were up by more than total costs on a percentage basis, and that consequently net income was up fairly strongly. That is described in our situation. Sales and costs increased, but sales rose more on a percentage basis. This is the pattern that I'm going to study right now. So in the future, if we are ever analyzing financial results or financial performance, and if the sales, costs, and net income fit this same pattern, then I will already have an idea of how I can describe that. And that is given to us below. So let's look at each one in turn. So one way to describe this would be to say net income increased by 15.8% in 2020 as stronger sales more than outpaced costs. Here we mention the increase in net income and relate that to performance of sales and costs. And this expression, more than outpaced means went farther or went faster than. So stronger sales, and we saw stronger sales in our expansion of vocabulary as being one way to describe sales being up. We can say stronger sales, more than outpaced, meaning that sales increased by more than costs, which in fact has happened. Sales increased by 10.1% and costs only increased by 4.1%. Normally, if sales increase by 10% or so, you might expect costs to increase by 10% by the same amount. The two usually should move in line here. In this case, sales went up, costs did not go up as much as you thought or expected, and that's why net income was even higher. So this one sentence describes what's going on and why very efficiently in just a few words. That's one way to describe it. Let's look at description number 2. Net income rose by 15.8% in 2020, reflecting higher sales coupled with an improved profit margin. So we saw some of these words already in prior lectures: reflecting, and then coupled with instead of and then an improved profit margin. We know what profit margin means, and improved means it went up. So this one expression, improved profit margin, tells us that sales went up by this amount and costs went up by a lesser amount, so that the difference between the two increased. That's our profit margin. So that one sentence two does a nice job of describing scenario one. Let's look at description number three. Net income grew by 15.8% in 2020 due to stronger sales and improved cost efficiencies. Okay, we've seen some of these terms before. Due to, that's instead of because. Stronger sales is a way to mention sales going up. Improved cost efficiencies, well, that means we have spent less money, which means that if sales went up this amount, you might expect costs to go up by the same percentage amount, but they didn't. They went up by less on a percentage amount, which means the company has become more efficient. They've been able to produce more at relatively less cost than before. Notice the vocabulary that we are using for net income. I have increased, rose, grew. Those are all fine. So these three separate descriptions, each one sentence, serve to describe scenario one. Let's look at another scenario. Scenario two. Well, in scenario two, the data for 2019 has not changed. So these values are the same as they were in scenario one. Total sales in 2020 is the same as scenario one. So total sales, in fact, has not changed, still up 10.1%. But what has changed now are total costs in 2020. Total costs in 2020 were quite a bit higher. They are up 17.5% in 2020. Because of that, net income actually declined, and it declined by 10.5%. So our situation analysis here, sales and costs increased, but costs rose more on a percentage basis. In fact, here they did indeed. Okay, how can we describe this scenario in one sentence? Well, let's take a look. Description one. Net income fell by 10.5% in 2020 as stronger sales were more than offset by rising costs. So we saw this expression more than offset by in a prior lecture. So we mentioned that net income fell. So we had stronger sales. And you might say, well, how can you have net income declining when sales are up 10.1%? And the answer is because this increase in net sales was more than offset by rising costs. So the rising costs took us all the way in the opposite direction and then even further. Rising costs more than offset stronger sales. So this one sentence does a nice job of describing scenario two. There's also a second description. We can say, despite stronger sales in 2020, net income declined by 10.5% as a result of substantially higher overall costs. Here again, as a result of, we've seen that before, conjunctive phrase instead of because. This is a nice way of creating this sentence because it starts with stronger sales. You might think that because sales were stronger, income would be higher, but it's not. So despite is used to indicate that we're about to say something contrary to what you might expect. So description two, so one line sentence that serves very well to describe scenario two. Let's look at another one. Scenario three. Well, the financial data in 2019 remains the same, but now in 2020, all things have changed. Now we see that things are going down. So total sales now declined in 2020 by 1.7%. Total costs declined by 5.2% to $9.2 billion. Now that's actually fairly good because if total sales were down, say 2%, you might expect that costs went down by 2% as well. But in fact, costs went down quite a bit more, which means that you were able to economize or become efficient. And that's a good thing. Because of this, net income was actually higher. 5.3% higher in the period. So you can have declining sales, yet a higher net income. The answer is what happened to costs. If costs fall far enough, that can drive net income higher. Okay, so this is a different scenario than we have seen in the prior two scenarios. How can we describe this in one sentence? Well, description number one, we can say, despite a softening in sales in 2020, net income rose as a result of a significant reduction in overall costs. So we saw this expression, a softening in sales, as a way to indicate sales going down. Despite gives us the indication that we are about to say something contrary to what you might expect. So here the expectation is if sales softened in 2020, you might expect that net income was down because sales were down. But in fact, that's not the case. It was the opposite. Net income rose as a result of a significant reduction in overall costs. So that one sentence describes very well scenario three. Let's look at another description. Even though sales were weaker in 2020, net income increased due to an improvement in cost efficiencies. Even though is another indication that we are about to say something contrary to what you might expect, just like despite, we say net income increased due to an improvement in cost efficiencies. So what does that mean? That we were able to produce the same amount, say, at less cost. We were more efficient. This is a nice description because an improvement in cost efficiencies is a nice thing. It's always nice to be able to say that. And in this case, we are attributing the net income gain to that. So that's a very positive thing. Very nice way of characterizing scenario three. And let's look at a third description. An improved profit margin drove net income higher in 2020 despite a slowdown in sales. Here we have a characterization, slowdown or slowing in sales, meaning sales are going down, right? And we relate this to an improved profit margin. In this case, sales have gone down, but costs have gone down even farther. So the difference then between the selling price and the cost has increased because costs went down even farther. So our profit margin was larger, and we can characterize that by saying the profit margin was improved. So this third description, one sentence, which does a very nice job of describing scenario three. Okay, we've looked at almost all possible scenarios. There's only one left, scenario four. Take a look at here. Here again, we start off the same. In 2019, there's no change. Things in 2020 look a little bleak. We see sales fell 14.3% to 10.2 billion. Costs were also down 7.2% to 9 billion. So costs were down, but not as much as you would expect. If sales are down 14%, you might expect that costs would be down about 14% as well. But they're only down by 7%, which means that it costs you a little bit more than you would expect to produce the volume that you did produce. Not surprisingly, the net income declined, and it declined substantially by 47.4% from 1.9 billion to $1 billion. Situation analysis here, sales and costs decreased, but sales fell more on a percentage basis. All right, this scenario is bad news all around. Sales were down, net income is down substantially, and your costs are not as low as you would expect them to be, which means you have actually wasted some money. You've spent a little more than you should have. There's really no nice way to put this, and we really only have one description for this scenario four, and it is this. Net income fell sharply by 47.4% in 2020, reflecting both weaker overall sales and a lower profit margin. We came across this reflecting in our prior lecture, and so there are the two reasons for it. Sales were weaker overall, and we had a lower profit margin. So this one sentence again does a nice job of describing this dismal performance. Now that we have these 4 scenarios in hand, we're ready to go to the next step, the real step. Take a look at the income statement of Ford Motor Company. We're going to try to identify which of these 4 scenarios is applicable to Ford Motor Company. That'll give us a head start in putting together a financial analysis in words. Then we'll just look for a few other key line items that might be important to our analysis.
We are finally ready to put all of the pieces together and write a verbal description of financial performance. I recommend that before you watch this video, you have a few things handy. The income statement of Ford Motor Company, you should have that printed out and by your side. You can find that in the material of prior lectures. You should print out the material on the 4 scenarios, financial scenarios that we studied, the material on how to present changes from one quarter to the next, and finally the material on expanding your vocabulary. You will need all of these things in this lecture. You will have an opportunity to attempt yourself to write a verbal description, but don't do that just yet. Watch this video. We will study the income statement together and identify those salient points that should be included in a verbal description. In the video, I will tell you when you can stop the video and try to write a description on your own. After that, I'll show you mine.
Here we are back at the income statement of Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries. Our goal now is to describe in words what is going on in all of this data. We are going to confine ourselves just with the second quarter of 2019. So looking down this column of numbers, how can we put into words what is basically going on? What are the pertinent factors that are driving performance? The first place that we can start is to identify which of the 4 scenarios that we studied in the prior lecture is applicable to Ford Motor Company. So let's do that. So the first thing that we see here is that net income declined from this level to this level. So we had a pretty big drop in net income after taxes. Let's take a look at our 4 scenarios to see which scenarios could be candidates based only on that information. These are the scenarios. This is scenario 1. So you see in this case, net income went up. Okay, so that's not appropriate for us. Here we have net income went down in scenario 2. So scenario 2 could be a candidate. Scenario 3, net income went up, so that's not applicable. Scenario 4, net income went down, so that could be a candidate. So we have 2 possible scenarios, scenario 2 and scenario 4. Let's go back to the income statement. So remember that our scenarios just looked at net income, total sales, and total costs. Total sales, total revenues, I use those terms interchangeably. We see here at Ford Motor Company that total revenues were down in the period. They went from here to here, down slightly, but they are down. So of scenario 2 and 4 that we identified, which one has total revenues going down? Well, scenario 2, no, that has total revenues going up. So that's not appropriate. Let's look at scenario 4. And yes, we see that total sales or total revenues went down. All right, there's one last thing I want to look at. Back to our income statement. We see here at Ford Motor Company that costs went up from this value to this value. But what happened in scenario 4? If we jump back in scenario 4, we see that costs went down. And you might think, well, okay, then Ford Motor Company is not scenario 4. But in fact, it is scenario 4. It's just a little bit worse than what we've shown here. Scenario 4 basically means that sales went down and costs went down as you would expect, but they did not go down as much as you expected. Well, Ford Motor Company was even worse. Not only did costs not go down, they actually went up. So scenario 4 is Ford Motor Company, but unfortunately, Ford Motor Company did even worse than this. All right, so then we have identified Ford Motor Company as being scenario 4. That means that this description is something that we can follow when we are putting a performance report into words. Net income fell sharply by 47.4% in 2020, reflecting both weaker overall sales and a lower profit margin or a lower margin. So we'll keep that in mind as you are writing a description for Ford Motor Company. Now let's go back and look at the income statement in a little bit more detail. So we've taken care of net income, the bottom line. We've taken care of revenues and expenses. That information we can get from scenario 4. I don't need to look at these individual components of total revenues because I'm focusing just on the aggregate value. Same with the cost of sales. I'm just focusing at the aggregate value. Let's look at the other components and let's see if any of them significantly contributed to performance. Well, interest on automotive debt went from this value to this value. That's fairly small. I don't think that had much of an impact on overall performance. Interest on other debt was unchanged, so by definition, there is no impact there. Other income, well, went from this level to this level. That is a pretty big drop. And that, in fact, was largely responsible then for the drop that we see in net income. So we're going to have to mention other income in our analysis. Equity in affiliated companies, well, that change is kind of small. Income before taxes, that's just an aggregation of what is all above us. And then provision for income taxes, there is a change here, but income taxes are based on income. So you might expect that with the decline in income from here to here, you would pay less tax as well. So even though the amount that you pay in tax is less, we can't really attribute that as being a cause or affecting financial performance because it's in line with what you would expect. Net income is just an aggregate value of the above. This not much change, and here we have our bottom line. All right, so let's start putting down on a piece of paper the salient points that we need to mention before we attempt to write up a description of performance of Ford Motor Company. So if we look at this, Ford Motor Company, that's FMC, resembles which performance scenario? Well, we said that it is scenario number 4. So we'll keep that in mind as we're writing our description. Now let's look at the main points here. Well, the first thing that we're going to mention when we write this up is net income of Ford Motor Company. That's the bottom line. So you should always start with that. And what happened with net income? Well, it was down. We saw that. And how can we characterize that? Well, if you remember in our presentation of financial values from one period to the next, net income of Ford Motor Company was something that we characterized as being down substantially. So when we start our financial description, you can, in fact, just write the presentation that you've already done for comparing periods from one to the next. Let's take a look at how that might sound. Let's take a look back at the income statement. So here I am at the income statement. So we could begin our analysis by saying net income of Ford Motor Company was $148 million in the second quarter of 2019, a substantial drop from, or down substantially from, or a substantial decrease from $1.1 billion in the same period of 2018. So let me point out two things for you here. This number here, I think we will round to billions and take it to one decimal. We did that in a prior lecture. So instead of having to say 1,066,000,000, I'll just say 1.1 billion. It makes it faster to refer to that number. Secondly, we're talking about net income here with a drop, a decline in net income. What are the kind of words that we can use to describe that? Well, we did study that in expanding our vocabulary. Let's take a quick look. This was the handout for that. Income is here for a drop, so we can say a decrease in, so we can say net income decreased substantially, was down substantially, was substantially lower. We can say fell substantially or a substantial fall in net income. We can say a substantial decline in net income or a substantial reduction in net income. So you can pick any of these words that you wish to describe the fall in net income. We need to have the word substantial or substantially in there because it was fairly significant. All right, let's go back to our sheet of points. So this is the first thing then that we have to mention in our write-up. Now let's take a look at the next item. Well, we need to mention total revenues. When we do a write-up of performance here, we'll start with the most important line, which is net income, and then we'll look at the two most important determinants, revenues and expenses. So what happened with total revenues? Well, they also declined. And if you look at the presentation that we did from one quarter to the next, I believe that we identified the change in total revenues as being slight. So we need to describe or mention that total revenues were slightly down or slightly lower. Now, what words can we use for that? Well, let's go back to our vocabulary list. Here we are, and let me move up now to sales or revenues, the same thing. So they were down and it's slight. So we can say a slight decrease in revenues or down slightly or slightly lower, a slight fall in revenues or revenues fell slightly, slightly weaker, a slight weakening in revenues, a slight decline or a slight reduction in revenues, a slight softening in revenues. So you may use any of these descriptive words to describe the decline in revenues, but we need to put the word slight in there. Let's go back to our income statement. So we talked about the bottom line. We talked about total revenues. We just need to mention total expenses. We see here that total expenses were up. Let's go back to our list of main points to cover. And now we said that we have to look at total expenses. And we saw that total expenses were higher. And can we say slightly higher or substantially higher? Well, if you look at when we did our presentations one quarter to the next, we decided that it is neither slight or substantial. So we'll just mention that total expenses are higher. Now, how can you characterize that? Well, let's take a look again at our vocabulary list. This is our vocabulary list. We're talking about expenses now. Here we go. Expenses were higher, so we can say an increase in expenses, or expenses were up. Higher expenses, a rise in expenses, or rising expenses, a pickup in expenses. So any of those words can be used to characterize the upward movement in expenses. Let's go back to our main points list. So I can mention revenues being slightly down, expenses being up, or I can mention something else that covers both of these activities. Remember that if this happens, if total revenues go down, you might expect total expenses to go down as well. If they do not go down as much as you expected, or if they go up, which happened in this case, then we can characterize that as being less cost efficient. We can say that cost efficiency has declined. And how can we describe this decrease in cost efficiency? Well, let's take a look at our vocabulary list. Here is our list. And efficiency or cost efficiency declining. So we can say a decrease in efficiency or a deterioration in efficiency or less efficient. All right, let's go back to our income statement. So we've talked about revenues and costs in the bottom line, and we identified on this statement there's only one other line item that we need to mention, and that's other income, and we see that it declined. So let's go back to our list of main points. Here we are. Okay, there is other income, and we mentioned that it declined. And how can we characterize that decline? Well, if you take a look at the presentation that we did from one quarter to the next, you'll see that we characterized this decline as being substantial. So we'll have to mention that that decline was substantial, and that's in income, other income. And you can go back to our vocabulary list to see what kind of words you can use to describe that decline. These here are the main points which we have to include in our write-up of performance. There's only one point that I want to make clear, and to do that, let's take a quick look again at the income statement. If you take a look at the change in net income from this period to this period, well, that change is just over 900 million US dollars. So that's the change we're talking about. Take a look at the change in other income from $1 billion to this. Well, that's about $732 million. So this change rate here represents by far most of the change that we see here in the bottom line. It's approximately 3/4 of the change, or maybe even a little bit more than that. We did mention here that contributing to the decline in net income was a decline in sales, but this is very slight. If you look at the dollar amount in this, it's very small. Also contributing to the decline in net income was an increase in costs. But what is this increase in costs? Well, you're looking at just over 400 million. Okay, that's not insignificant, but it certainly is small compared to the change that we saw in other income here. So the point that I want to make is this. Let's go back to our main points page. Here we are. And the point is that other income, this had the largest impact on the change in net income. So in view of the fact that this is more important than what happened here, in terms of organizing our statement, I think we'll start with this, then we'll mention what happened in other income, and then we'll mention these two things also contributed, but to a lesser extent. So that is the information that we need to include in our presentation, and remember that it also follows scenario 4 of our write-up. So what I suggest is that you stop the video here and attempt to write in 2 or maybe 3 sentences at most what happened in Ford Motor Company in the second quarter of 2019. Then return to playing this video, and I will show you my written explanation. Okay, we're back, and I hope that you gave it a good try for writing. It's not an easy exercise. I know even my advanced business students have some difficulty putting these complete sentences together on paper, but let's take a look at it, and let me show you what I did. So the financial performance summary. Well, we mentioned that the first thing we need to do is just present what happened to the bottom line, and that might look something like this. Net income of Ford Motor Company was 148 million US dollars in the second quarter of 2019, down substantially from $1.1 billion in the same period of 2018. So you see I used the reference 1.1 billion to make it quicker and easier to refer to that number. I used down, but there are other words that you can use, and that would be fine as well. So this, I would think you probably got this because this is the exact same pattern we used when we were presenting financial values and comparing from one quarter to the next. Let me just show you a different way that this sentence can be written just for variety, you could say this. Net income of Ford Motor Company fell substantially in the second quarter of 2019 to 148 million US dollars from 1.1 billion US dollars in the same period of 2019. It's the same content. I just reorganized things a little bit. I find that if you put the dollar values in the two periods fairly close together in the sentence, then it is easier for people to remember the prior value when you're mentioning the recent value. All right, so that's the first thing done. Now we need to talk about the substantial decline in other income, and then what happened in total revenues and total expenses. And I think I'm going to combine all of that into one sentence. Let's take a look at what I wrote. There is the one sentence. The decline was mostly due to a substantial reduction in other income, although it also reflected slightly weaker revenues coupled with higher costs and expenses. In the sentence here, you see due to, we learned about that. That's instead of using because. Same here, also reflected is because. Coupled with, I used instead of and. I used reduction to describe the decline in other income, and it was substantial. Revenues were slight, and I used weaker here. You can use other words like a slight drop in revenues or a slight decline in revenues. Higher costs and expenses. So I just used higher to describe this movement. You could say an increase in costs and expenses. You could also say slightly weaker revenues coupled with lower cost efficiencies or a deterioration in cost efficiency. All of that would be acceptable. So ignore the green line here. I just gave that as another example. So these two sentences in black then would be sufficient to describe what happened in the second quarter of Ford Motor Company in 2019. And that's how we do it. Let's try one more. We'll continue to look at Ford Motor Company, although this time we'll look at an updated income statement, and I will leave you completely on your own to see how you can go through there and describe financial performance in a written summary. That is the object of our next and final lecture.
In this lecture, this last lecture, now I leave the reins in your hands. You will be confronted with an income statement of Ford Motor Company, but an updated income statement, and I'll have you look at it by yourself to analyze it, identify the main points, and then try to write a verbal description of financial performance. Try to do that all on your own first, and then watch this video for my explanation and analysis.
This is the consolidated income statement for Ford Motor Company and subsidiaries as of year-end, December 31st. And our goal is to write a description for financial performance for the year 2021. Let's just take a look at these values and understand a little bit about what is going on. So this is the column of interest for us. The first thing we can look at the bottom line, the most important thing, net income. We see that net income was 17,937 million US dollars in 2021. That compares to this in brackets. Now, we have not seen this before, but a value in brackets means a loss. Some people refer to that as a negative income, but that's not too typical by convention. We'll say a loss. So if I wanted to present net income attributable to Ford Motor Company here, And just to make things a little bit easier and faster, I will place these values in billions and round to one decimal. The presentation would be as follows. Net income attributable to Ford Motor Company was 17.9 billion US dollars in 2021, up substantially from a net loss of 1.3 billion US dollars in 2020. So that presentation of net income will be the first sentence in our descriptive analysis. Doesn't have to be exactly those words, but something similar to that. Now let's look and see what is going on. Well, total revenues I see went from this value to this value. So that's an increase. And I would consider that to be a substantial increase. If I just look at a percentage change from here to here, that's up a little over 7%. That's pretty substantial in 1 year. If I look at total costs and expenses here, went from this value to this value here. So they went up as well, but not as much as you would expect. If revenues went up 7%, I might expect costs to go up by 7% as well, more or less. But they didn't. This movement from this value to this value is something like 0.2%. So we have had a big movement up in net income, big movement up in sales, and costs went up a lot less than we might expect. With that in mind, let's see what financial scenario out of our 4 scenarios represents that profile. This is the handout that accompanied the financial performance summaries in a prior lecture. Let's take a look at our scenarios. Well, scenario 1 here, what is happening? Well, we had net income increasing by quite a bit. Okay, we've seen that, Ford Motor Company. We've had sales or revenues increasing by quite a bit. Yes, we saw that with Ford Motor Company. And we had total costs increasing, but by less than what you might expect. And that indeed was this scenario at Ford Motor Company. So Ford Motor Company then resembles scenario 1, which means that any one of these 3 descriptive sentences we can make use of when we are putting together our financial description of Ford Motor Company. I think I myself will use description 3. I like the idea of stronger sales and improved cost efficiencies, but any of these would be fine. Let's take a look at our sheet of basic points. We'll put the basic points together, and then we'll be ready to write a description. This is a sheet of basic points for Ford Motor Company in 2021. FMC, that's Ford Motor Company, resembles which performance scenario? Well, we already identified scenario 1 as being the relevant scenario. Now let's look at the main points, and I think we'll start with net income. Net income of Ford Motor Company, what happened there? Well, we saw that it increased and increased substantially. So we will mention that first in our written description of performance. Now let's look at the main components of net income. First one being total revenues. Well, total revenues, as you recall, also increased substantially. And what happened with total expenses? Well, let's take a jump back to the income statement and take a look. We see that total costs and expenses went from 131.5 billion to 131.8 billion US dollars. So they did increase, but the increase was slight. So let's make a note of that on our main points page. Let's take a look at total expenses. And we said that the change was up, but slightly. Now, when I have total revenues going up by quite a bit and expenses not going up as much as I would expect, then I can characterize that in 2 ways. I can say that the profit margin has improved, or I can say that cost efficiency has improved. I myself will use cost efficiency. So we can say then that the cost efficiency went up in 2021. Let's take a look now again at the income statement and see if there are any other main points to put in our list. The first thing I want to point out is that you see this line item right here, operating income or loss, if it's in brackets, that is a new line item. We did not see this in the prior financial statement that we looked at. So Ford Motor Company added this in. And what this is, very simply, is total revenues less total costs and expenses. And that's the value right here. So we can see that income related to the production and sale of cars and trucks went from a loss of 4.4 billion US dollars in 2020 to a gain of 4.5 billion US dollars in 2021. Take a look at the next line item, interest expense on company debt. Okay, there's a slight increase there, but I don't think that's enough to warrant mention in our description. Take a look at other income. Other income went from 4.9 billion US dollars in 2020 to 14.7 billion US dollars in 2021. That's an increase of almost 10 billion, I think 9.8 billion dollars. Okay, that's pretty significant. So this is an increase of 9.8 billion. And this here increase from a loss here to this gain is an increase of about 8.9 billion. So they're almost the same. This other income here is a little bit higher, but we can say that roughly the contribution to net income was just as much from here as it was from here. So I don't think then that we need to put other income in front like we did in the last lecture. The change in other income was quite significant compared to everything else, so it deserved to be mentioned first. In this case, the change in income from revenues less expenses, that too was quite significant. So then we will maintain sort of the traditional pattern, and we'll talk about net profit first, what happened, or net income, and then we'll talk about sales and expenses, and then we'll talk about other income in that order. So we definitely need to mention other income, and it went up substantially. So let's jump back to our list of main points. And let's add other income to that list and the fact that it was up substantially. And finally, as I mentioned, the contribution to other income and revenues less expenses was more or less equal. So let's just make a note of that. So other income had more or less the same or an equal impact on the change in net income, as did revenues and expenses. So these are the main points that we need to include in our write-up. Let's go back to the income statement and make sure there isn't anything else that needs to be in this list. Okay, we talked about other income, equity and net income. Okay, yes, it was up, but I don't think this change is sufficient enough to warrant anything. Income before income taxes, well, that's just a summation of the items above. Provision for income taxes. Let me talk a little bit about this here. You see, in this case, this is a negative number. What that means is it's a credit or money that you have coming back, or a credit that you can use to offset future tax liabilities. So this is a positive. You see that this then is added to this so that after tax, your situation has actually improved. Now the question is, should we mention that or not? Well, the first thing is you would not expect this to be negative. If Ford Motor Company made $17.8 billion in 2021, you would expect that they would pay some taxes related to that income. But in fact, they paid no taxes. In fact, they got some money back, if you wish to think of it that way. So that's a bit unusual, and you might think it's worth mentioning. However, let me point this out to you. If you take a look at the prior year, their tax liability was very small, $160 million. So the movement from this to a tax rebate, if you will, of this, those are still small figures when we're talking about 17 or 18 billion dollars on the bottom line. So because this value is small, I'm inclined not to include it in our list of main points and not to mention it in our financial description. Now, let me say this. Let's say that income before taxes was something very small. Let's say that it was, $1 billion. And in the year prior, let's say that it was $2 billion. But let's say that in the tax situation, there was $3 billion in tax as a credit on this line. And this line was a positive tax that you might see, maybe even this value. So my point is this, that if the tax credit is large enough so that it changes the profile before taxes, let's say that it changes so much that what would have been a decrease in income is now an increase in income because of a tax credit. If that happened, then I would consider the tax credit to be something significant to the financial performance. And in that case, I would mention it in my write-up. But in this case, the change in the tax position, dollar values, is not that significant, and it does not change the financial profile of what happened, say, before taxes were paid and after taxes were paid. So for that reason, I'm not going to mention it. All right, so then I think that we have all of the points that are necessary in our description. So let's take a look at writing that description. These are our main points, and let's take a look at how this might be written. Well, the first sentence is just the presentation of net income of Ford Motor Company, and that might look something like this. Net income of Ford Motor Company was $17.9 billion in 2021, up substantially from a net loss of $1.3 billion in 2020. So you see here that I've changed the units to billions, and I've rounded to one decimal place to make it a little bit easier and faster to refer to those numbers. The movement was substantial, so we need that word in there. I said up substantially, but you could say a substantial increase or rose substantially, as you wish. Now we need to describe the rest of it, and we can actually do that in one sentence. Take a look at what I have. The increase was due to substantially stronger sales coupled with improved cost efficiencies, as well as a substantial pickup in other income. So this is an example of what I would write to describe financial performance of Ford Motor Company in 2021. 2 short sentences. Now, your description may be different from this. That's fine, as long as you have the main points in your discussion, then that is what matters. Now, if you want to practice even further, you can try another one on your own from the income statement. Let's take a look. So we did the movement from 2020 to 2021, but you can try a description from 2019 to 2020 if you wish. I won't be correcting that in a future lecture, but if you want to try that on your own, just by way of practice, I think that's a pretty good idea. By the way, I will tell you that the income statement from Ford Motor Company, like most, if not all, publicly traded companies, can be retrieved off the internet free of charge. That's where I got this. So if you want to practice your skills even more, perhaps with Ford Motor Company and other income statements, or with other companies altogether, go ahead. I encourage you to do that. As they say, practice makes perfect.